Thank you, Dato Saifuddin, for his brief speech and brief but well comprehensive elaboration of the views by Professor Tariq Ramadan on what he believes, in the title, What I Believe. In fact, Dato Saifuddin himself hinted in some ways what he believed. Part of it is his belief that he don't play music and sing, in a way. But of course, we also know that Dato Saifuddin also believes strongly when it comes to the hope of the nation. He is the chief of the Pakatan Harapan Secretariat. And okay, I don't want to talk much about politics because that's not exactly our main topic of discussion. But I want to move to the main topic of discussion for today, which is also related to politics. It's an important and critical question on: does democracy in Muslim societies require secularism? It could be interesting. It could also sound controversial as well in the Malaysian context. So understanding that we are among the many other Muslim societies, democracy is definitely not a foreign idea or principle in Muslim societies. In fact, democracy is among the things with the coming together, I would put, between Muslim societies and modernity, perhaps over the past 1 century. We have seen that Muslim societies react to the ideal of democracy quite differently. But based on a few studies, at least I'm quoting a study by the Pew Research in 2012. This study actually have empirically explained that actually Muslim societies, when it comes to the views of the people, they are very familiar and they are very supporting to the ideals and principles of democracy. This is a very important contestation to the views that Islam is actually against the principle of democracy. These studies have proven otherwise. However, at the same time, if we look back into our own societies, Muslim societies mainly, let's see things globally in different countries. What we can see is that democracy doesn't really flourish in Muslim societies. There's also another study made by the Economist Intelligence Unit in 2016. It shows that most Muslim countries, or we can say as Muslim societies, are not really within the best of the countries with good democracy ratings. Even the best among us is considered as to be among the flawed democracy. And that also includes Malaysia. That's not my statement, that is a statement by the study itself. And those who are, as I say, those who are being seen good in democracy is actually being seen as flawed democracy. So there is this kind of something doesn't meet. Muslims in general, based on studies, say that they accept and they see the principles of democracy highly. But when it comes to how does it being implemented on the actual life of our societies, we are not really capable of shaping a democratic principle. This brings us to one important part, which is one of the key pillars in most, I would put it as Western societies, which is secularism. Part of the way, perhaps, how democracy flourishes is also because of secularism is being put as among the key foundation of the country itself. So this brings us to the question, could it be what is actually missing in Muslim societies is actually the principle of secularism itself? So now the main question comes forward. Does democracy in Muslim societies require secularism? So as a brief setting on that, I think without further elaboration, I would like to pass the session to our moderator today, Dato. Okay, I will straight away invite our guest speaker, our main guest speaker today, Professor Nader Hashemi. He has written quite a number of books. Among them has also been previously translated by IRF, Secularism, Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy, if I'm not mistaken, that was the title. And he's a professor in the University of Denver. Besides that, he's also conducted quite a number of research in other institutions, including in Harvard and the UCLA. Without further delay, I would like to invite Professor Nader Hashemi to give his talk, and then it will be followed by Dr. Farouk, who will be continuing the discussion as the moderator later. I would like to invite Professor Nader Hashemi. Okay.
Well, assalamu alaikum. Thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you to the Islamic Renaissance Front for bringing me back to Malaysia for the third time. I want to say that it's extremely gratifying for me to be outside of Donald Trump's America for a few days. Things are very dark in the United States today, as they are everywhere around the world in terms of the struggle for democracy, but I'm happy to be with you all this afternoon and over the next couple of days. I want to begin by dedicating my remarks this afternoon on the topic of democracy in Muslim societies to all of the political prisoners that are languishing in the jails across the Muslim world. Unfortunately, one of the distinguishing features of Muslim societies today is that the jails are filled with opposition activists who are in these prisons for no other reason because of their commitment to democracy and their commitment to nonviolent political change. So I want to dedicate my remarks to all of those people, and since we are in Malaysia, I want to dedicate and single out one particular individual who deserves special recognition, Anwar Ibrahim, whose remarks who I'm thinking of today as I was preparing these remarks on the question of democracy in secularism in Muslim societies. So the question on the agenda, as was just announced, is: does democracy in Muslim societies require secularism? My answer to the question is a qualified yes, but the point of contention revolves around the concept of secularism. The answer really depends on what you mean by the term secularism. My own preference is that when I come to Muslim communities, Muslim societies, is to try and avoid the term secularism. Because secularism in Muslim societies is a conversation stopper. It's a controversial term. There's a lot of baggage associated with it. And I try to avoid the term if I can. I much prefer to try and discuss the values associated with secularism in its ideal form that can contribute to the building of a just society, a democratic society, and an equitable society. At the university level, among intellectuals, among elite groups, I'm happy to use the term secularism. But I would never use the secularism. I would try to avoid it if I was ever speaking to Muslims at the level of the mosque, at the level of a general audience. Now, I want to make several points at the outset to begin the conversation. I want to clarify in my remarks what the term secularism, what the concept actually refers to, and what the different meanings of secularism suggest in terms of the concept itself. I want to also discuss fundamentally what's really critical to this event. What is the fundamental connection and relationship between democracy and secularism? Is there a relationship, or is this completely a fiction? And in the end, I want to end by summarizing and commenting on a speech on the topic of Islam and secularism that was given not too long ago by a prominent Muslim intellectual and leader who you were all familiar with, Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi, who delivered a lecture on this topic in 2012 that I think bears on this topic that brings us all together. So if I can go to the next slide. So secularism, one of the problems with secularism is that it is inherently an ambiguous concept. There is no global agreement on what the term refers to. Everyone knows this is a smartphone. We can all agree on what it is, but the concept of secularism, its origins, its various dimensions, and particularly its relationship to politics, is deeply contentious. So the immediate problem that one has is trying to define the term. What does secularism actually mean? What does it suggest? What values does it seek to promote, and what problems in society does it seek to resolve? Does secularism imply anti-clericalism? Does secularism imply atheism? The disestablishment of religion from the state? state neutrality, the rejection of religious symbols in the public sphere, the complete and robust separation of religion and politics in public life, or more narrowly, does secularism simply mean the separation of the state and its institutions from the influence of religious forces? So one way, I think, in my own view of, I think, trying to enhance clarity about secularism is to think about it against the backdrop of these three disciplines of the social sciences: philosophy, sociology, and political science. Philosophically speaking, secularism refers to the rejection of the transcendental and the metaphysical, with a focus on the existential and the empirical. In other words, the rejection or the repudiation or the distancing from any reference to God or the divine. That's philosophical secularism. Some people are committed, when they talk about secularism, that's what they mean. The much more common definition of secularism is the sociological interpretation. It correlates with the process of modernization, the transition of societies from traditional roots to modern ways of living. It's a gradual process, sociological secularism is, that leads to the declining influence of religion in social institutions, in communal life, and in human relationships. This is the most common understanding of secularism that many people have when they use the term. It's associated with this book that the prominent sociologist of religion, Peter Berger, called A Process by Which Sectors of Society and Culture Are Removed from the Domination of Religious Institutions and Symbols. Now, the third dimension of secularism is the political dimension. Secularism, politically, entails or suggests some form of separation between the realm of politics and the realm of religion, which can vary. It could mean a complete, robust separation of politics in its entirety with religion, or it can mean simply a very narrow separation between the state and religious institutions. It's this third dimension that I think is most interesting. But having said that, I want to point out that one can be philosophically very religious, sociologically very religious, in terms of spending all of your time in religious institutions, while at the same time being politically secular. So these three categories are not mutually exclusive. If you take the figure, or if you think about the figure of Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Desmond Tutu, all of these people were philosophically very religious. Sociologically, they spent most of their time in religious institutions, but politically, their convictions were secular in the sense that they believed in some form of separation between the realm of politics and the realm of religion, because doing so would advance the prospects of a just society. But I want to focus my remarks on the third dimension of secularism, if you go to the next slide. Now, in the history of the West, of Europe, there's two broad traditions of political secularism that have been passed on to the world. The Anglo-English version of secularism, which is rooted in the Protestant Reformation and the wars of religion that consumed Europe in the 16th and 17th century, that produced a series of lessons and a political model that demanded freedom for religion from state control. And this required some form of separation between state and religion. The idea was that all these different religious groups are intolerant of one another. They are all competing to advance their own interest against other religious groups. And in order to create a level playing field for all religions, the state should not be preferencing or biased to one particular religion. There had to be some sort of religious equality. So that was the argument that John Locke first advanced in his famous letter on toleration, that there had to be some sort of separation. That's broadly the British English and American version of secularism. The other model of secularism that comes out of the European experience is the French model, known as laïcité in French. It's a different model of secularism that is much more hostile and suspicious of the role that religion plays in politics. And this has to do with the unique historical experience of France. France, prior to the French Revolution, had a monarch that was closely in alliance with the Catholic Church. And when the revolution takes place in France, it takes place against the monarchy and also against the Catholic Church. That was the dominant hegemonic force. And so the big concern for the French revolutionaries and the political model that comes out of the French experience is this argument that in order to advance and in order to have a democratic society, we need freedom from religion. Not freedom for religion, but freedom from. The less religion, the better. And this is based on simply the unique historical experience of France coming into the modern period. And this is why the French are so completely hostile and very suspicious when people start wearing religious symbols in the public sphere. The hijab debate in France, the more recent burkini debate on French beaches are very much connected to this idea that, look, if people are advancing a religious identity in the public sphere, this will lead to chaos, this will lead to division. You can be religious in your private sphere. If you're going to come into the public school system, if you're going to come into the state, you have to be completely non-religious or else society will break down. Now we have another historical experience with respect to the history of secularism, and that's the history of secularism in the Islamic world. Next slide, please. Now, the history of secularism in the Islamic world is a long and complicated one. I'm not going to give you the entire history. I've written about it. It's in my book that's been translated into Malaysian. There's all these debates that have been advanced over the years that have made the argument that Islam is unique among all of the religions in the world in that it cannot accommodate the notion of secularity. Prominent scholars in the West, such as Bernard Lewis and Samuel Huntington and Ernest Gellner, have made this case. In the Islamic world, the rise of mainstream political Islamist thinking associated with the Muslim Brotherhood movement in Iran, with Khomeini and the revolutionaries, they've also actually made an argument that, look, Islam is uniquely different. It cannot separate the realm of religion from politics. Islam is inherently deen, wadola, religion and government, and there's a lot of strong historical arguments to be made that come from the bosom and the heart of Islam, the concept of Tawheed. Everything is united and connected in terms of the oneness of God. You can't separate the realm of politics from the realm of religion. The figure of the Prophet Muhammad himself, he was both a religious leader and a political leader. That's the model that Muslims have used to think about and to construct their own modern polity. So they're very strong arguments that have sought to make this claim that Islam is somehow uniquely unable to secularize. And the other argument that you sometimes hear is that within the history of the Arab and Islamic world, there never was a term that was coined that refers to secularism. The term that is used in Arabic, al-maniyya, this worldliness, coming from the concept of ilm or science, is not the equivalent of secularism. In Persian, there is no word for secularism. They simply just coin or they adapt the English word secularism. And even in the Turkish case, there is no independent word. So these are all arguments that have been advanced. Now, one of the problems is that when secularism started to enter the Islamic world, one of the early translations of the term secularism by Jamaluddin al-Afghani, the founding father of modern Islamic political thought, was he translated the term secularism and he equated it with atheism. This gave secularism a negative association in the minds of Muslim thinkers right from the beginning. But much more importantly, I think, the problem of secularism in the Muslim world is associated with these dictators and despots that you see on the screen, who come to power in the post-colonial era of the Islamic world, after World War II roughly, and they justify their rule in various forms of secular nationalism. And these secular nationalist ideologies are justifying forms of government that increasingly are associated with repressive, dictatorial, and anti-democratic rule. And so secularism in the minds of many Muslim activists in the Arab world and in Iran and in Turkey to a certain extent is associated with dictatorial, repressive rule. That's, I think, the key association that has given secularism a very bad name, and it has made an attempt to justify secularism in Muslim societies much more difficult for people who are interested in thinking about this relationship between secularism and Islam and in Muslim societies. So this brings us to a situation where we have to think about secularism and its relationship to democracy in much more profound and deeper ways if we want to figure out, first of all, whether there is an inherent relationship between the two. There's an assumption that, yes, secularism means democracy, but if you think about it for a moment, the most secular political system in the world today is North Korea. No democracy there. In the 20th century, the most repressive political systems were overtly and explicitly secular. Soviet Union, Communist China, Nazi Germany, and other secular forms of government. So secularism in and of itself does not equate with democracy. This is an association that I think is part of the, I think, biased view that many people have coming from a particular European Enlightenment perspective, where they simply associate secularism in its best manifestations, ignoring the ugly examples that we have where secularism is also connected with totalitarianism and authoritarianism. But this begs the question, what is the relationship, and is there a relationship between democracy and secularism? And I would argue there absolutely is. If you are serious about understanding democracy in societies where there are religious actors and where people have a religious identity and where people want that religious identity to inform political decision-makings and political choices, then the question of secularism is absolutely important. If you were talking theoretically or hypothetically about a society where people didn't have a religious identity, there was no religious parties, religion wasn't on the public debate, then the question of secularism really is less important. But because today we're living at a point in time in Muslim history where the identity that many Muslims have is rooted in a particular conviction that they want their Islamic values represented in politics, then this question of secularism is extremely important. So if we go to the next slide, I want to briefly talk about what the theoretical and philosophical relationship between democracy and secularism actually is. And roughly 15 years ago, one of the great scholars of democracy, Alfred Stepan, who recently passed away, wrote, I think, the most insightful analysis that tried to focus and zero in on the question, how is democracy actually related to secularism? Is there a relationship there, or is there not? And so he coins this term, the twin tolerations. And the twin tolerations, according to Alfred Stepan, are these minimal boundaries of freedom of action that must somehow be crafted or developed between the state and its political institutions vis-a-vis religious institutions in society, and in reverse, the development of an argument and a set of ideas that religious institutions and forces in society must tolerate with respect to their attitude toward the state. So in other words, it's a two-way street. The state has to tolerate a certain sphere of freedom for religious actors and religious institutions to participate in political society, and in the reverse, religious actors and religious institutions also have to learn to develop a certain respect for the autonomy of political institutions in order for them to function independently. If you can craft those types of relationships in a political system, then you can begin to think about the relationship between democracy and secularism at a deeper level. And so Alfred Stepan, in trying to sort of make this argument, he talks about the core institutional requirements that democracy demands. And he goes through a list of arguments where he basically says you cannot have a democracy in any society worthy of the name unless you have a certain set of electoral democratic requirements that exist in a political system. Freedom to form and join organizations, freedom of expression, the right to vote, the integrity of the electoral system, running for public office, etc. A list of sort of 8 conditions that he says that sort of you would think would be rationally understandable if you wanted to have an electoral system that was really free and fair. But he says that's not enough. Democracy also requires a certain set of constitutionally protected rights for minority groups and basic liberties that are protected in the Constitution that protect people's basic human and civil rights. That's also a requirement for democracy. And then he goes on to sort of make an argument that in a political system where you have religious actors that are active in politics, those religious actors in a democracy should have the complete freedom to form associations, to advance their ideas in the public sphere, and to participate in policy-making decisions, provided that they don't violate the rights of other groups in society, and provided that they respect the twin tolerations. And he also goes on to say that the reverse has to take place as well. The state has to realize that the state cannot go into society and ban religious groups simply because they're religious. This is a two-way street. And then he gets to the crux of his argument. He says that, look, if you want to think about how democracy and secularism should coexist, it really boils down to this. Do democratically elected parliaments have complete autonomy and independence to make decisions that affect society free from interference or veto power or control of religious institutions in society? In other words, is the parliament or the National Assembly and the executive autonomous and free to make decisions without being subjected to veto power from a religious body? If you can guarantee that type of independence of democratic parliaments, that's the most important measure and the most important part of this theoretical debate on the relationship between religion and secularism. In other words, there must be, he's saying, Alfred Stepan, a minimum, absolute, guaranteed, rock-solid separation between democratically elected parliaments and the attempt by religious groups or religious institutions to veto the independence and the sovereignty of a democratically elected parliament. If that line gets bridged or broken, then democracy as we know it no longer exists. So just to cite one example from the Islamic world where this line of separation has been broken and you cannot have a democracy in this particular situation, it's the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran, where they have a democratically elected parliament, but they also have a guardian council that has veto power over the decisions of the parliament, and that guardian council is not elected by the people. It's appointed by the supreme leader. So in fact, you actually have two institutions, the Supreme Leader and the Guardian Council, that can veto the decisions that the democratically elected parliament might arrive at. In that sense, you don't have a democracy because that separation and independence and autonomy for the parliament is not there. So that's really the fundamental core requirement. And so what Alfred Stepan sort of says in his very famous essay, which I think is actually the best theoretical statement on the relationship between democracy and secularism, he says explicitly that secularism is not a core requirement for democracy, but the existence of the twin tolerations is a core requirement. Secularism is not a core requirement for democracy, but the existence of the twin tolerations is. And what he really is saying is that, yes, you do require some form of separation between the realm of politics and the realm of religion, but it's a much more narrow separation than most people realize. It's really a separation that revolves around this concept of the twin tolerations. As long as those twin tolerations, that concept is somewhere enshrined in the Constitution, then democracy can exist and religious groups can participate in society. If that line ever gets bridged or crossed, then democracy as we know it is compromised and you don't have a democracy that's worthy of the name. So that's the theoretical background. Now let me just go to the last slide and summarize a speech that was given by none other than Rashid Ghannouchi, who I was privileged to actually meet for the first time in 2014 when I went to his home in Tunis with Professor John Esposito. And this was a very fascinating time because in 2014, the post-Ben Ali democratic constitution of Tunisia had been passed by the Constitutional Assembly. The Arab Spring starts in Tunisia. The Arab Spring leads to the election of a constitutional assembly where the majority of the delegates come from Rashid Ghannouchi's party, and it's really Ennahda that plays a leading role in the democratic transition that followed the toppling of the dictator in Tunis. Around this time, right at the beginning of the process of writing a new constitution, Rashid Ghannouchi gives a very famous speech on Islam and secularism. It's been translated into English. I use it in my courses. If you want a copy of it, email me and I'll send it to you. But he starts in thinking about this question of about Islam and democracy by noting the obvious problem. He says this topic of Islam and secularism is quite problematic in the sense that it deals with Islam's relationship to a very emotionally charged topic known as secularism. Is this relationship one of conflict and discord or one of harmony and overlap? Related to this question, he says, are issues such as Islam's relationship to governance, the relationship between Islam and law, which are all deeply controversial matters. And he continues to say, the issue of the state's neutrality involves both great risk and adventure. If what we mean by the separation of religion and state is that the state is a human product and religion is a divine revelation, as the distinction was made clear in the context of the early Muslim community between the realm of revelation and what is the realm of the political, then he says, this is, quote, okay. But if what we mean by separation is in the French sense of the term, or in the Marxist experience, then we engage in a very dangerous adventure, he says, that may harm both religion and the state. The total stripping away of the state from any religious reference could turn the state, he says, into a mafia. The world economic system into exercising plundering and politics into deception and hypocrisy. And what he's really saying here in his speech is that if you completely remove religion from any connection to the state then can become simply a tool of political forces, and religion's moderating role, religion's ethical role, religion's role in trying to provide some moral guidance for political actors then gets removed from the equation, and this is a concern. He goes on to add and say in his speech that the primary orbit of religion is not the state's concern. The primary orbit of religion, he says, is the personal and the individual conviction of a believer. The state's duty, he says, is to provide services to people before anything else, to create jobs, to provide good health care and education, not to control the hearts and minds of citizens. For this reason, he says, I have opposed the coercion of people in all its forms and manifestation, and have dealt with such controversial topics such as apostasy, and have defended the freedom of people either to adhere to a particular religion or to defect from religion based on the Quranic principle of la ikra'a fid din. There is no compulsion in religion. He goes on to say that thus the greater part of the debate in Tunisia today on the question of Islam and secularism is really a misunderstanding and a confusion over what secularism actually means. Secularism, he says, is not inherently a formula for atheism, but merely a set of procedural arrangements designed to safeguard the freedom of belief and thought. There is also, he says, ambiguity with respect to Islam, but there are those who believe that Islam can only be victorious, he says, by confiscating people's freedom and imposing prayers, imposing fasting, and imposing the veil through force. He says this would be far from being successful because Allah Almighty has considered hypocrisy to be the greatest crime, and it will produce hypocrites. And he goes on to say that the hypocrites are strongly condemned in the Quran. And if you impose religion or use the state to force people to be religious, you force religious hypocrisy. And this is not something that is in the interests of Tunisia, and it's certainly not in keeping with the normative demands of Islam. And so then he goes on to conclude by saying, the fact that our revolution has succeeded in toppling a dictator, we ought to accept the principle of citizenship, and that this country does not belong to one party or another, but rather to all citizens, regardless of their religion, their sex, or any other consideration. Islam has bestowed on them the right to be citizens enjoying equal rights and to believe in whatever they desire within the framework of mutual respect and the observance of the law, which is legislated by their representatives in Parliament. This is my understanding of things, he says, and this is my view with respect to Islam's relationship to secularism. And so what he's really saying, if you read his speech in summary, is that secularism, if it's interpreted and if it's understood in the context of state neutrality toward religion in society and toward all its citizens, then it's perfectly compatible with Islam's ethical and normative tradition. And if that's the understanding of secularism, then there's no problem with talking about it or advancing the principle of secularity within politics. It's interesting, if you read Tunisia's 2014 democratically negotiated constitution, this constitution has won high praise from scholars and from democratic constitutionalists and from Muslim reformers around the world. If you read the constitution, there is no explicit reference to secularism. But the core values that secularism seeks to promote in terms of citizenship rights, in terms of equality in society, can be found in the document without actually specifically referencing the term secularism. And this is what secularism in its best manifestation really seeks to promote. In the formulation of one prominent scholar of secularism, the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, he says, secularism in its most ideal manifestation can be associated with those three principles that come out of the French Enlightenment tradition: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Secularism in its most ideal form seeks to promote liberty in terms of freedom of belief, freedom of expression. Secularism also seeks to promote a certain equality of citizenship and equal treatment of everyone under the law. And also secularism should also have a fraternal component, try to create and strengthen the bonds of community Those are the three fundamental principles of secularism that I think can be found in Tunisia's 2014 democratic constitution, which was passed as a result of the leadership of Ghannouchi and the Ennahda party. I happened to be there around the time after the constitution was just passed, and I attended a lecture by Sheikh Ghannouchi, where he was reflecting upon the very difficult transition period in Tunisia, that it looked like it was about to break down. When there was a coup d'etat in Egypt in 2013, there was deep fears that something similar will happen in Tunisia, and the entire democratic transition process will be broken. But because of the compromise and the sophisticated, I think, leadership of Tunisian political actors, of which Rashid Ghannouchi was the most important in my view, the constitution and the transition to democracy was successful. And in this speech that he was giving, reflecting upon this constitution, he said explicitly, and I'll never forget this, he said, this constitution that we have passed is the embodiment of the ideals and the goals that the Islamic reform movement in Tunisia has had going back 100 years. We were struggling to have a society and a political system where people could be free to think, free to express their religious identity, and if they didn't want to express their religious identity, free to express a different political identity. This constitution and the values is a success for every Muslim who's been struggling for democracy and struggling for Islamic reform in Tunisia. And it was a moment of deep celebration and a moment of triumph for the people of Tunisia, all of those people who believe in equality, social justice, and in Islam. And so in conclusion, my answer to the question that brings us here this afternoon, does democracy in Muslim societies require secularism? I think the answer to the question is a clear and unambiguous yes, but subject to the theoretical framework of Alfred Stepan and his concepts of the two twin tolerations, and also the arguments advanced by Rashid Ghannouchi, in which secularism understood as state neutrality is a model that I think Muslim societies can appreciate, can study, and can learn from. Thank you.